Thank you. My wife did get here to Florida, but just barely. Her flight was late, a couple hours late, and I just got her dropped off at the hotel about 5:15 and rushed on down here. But she'll be with us tomorrow. And I was sitting there at the airport for a while, wondering if I was going to have to take off and to be here for the service and just say, honey, I'll come get you sometime later. But I didn't really want to do that. It worked out better. Would you go with me, James chapter 3? Might share a prayer request with you. I have the privilege of being part of the Day Spring Bible College, which is the Bible college at Quinton Road Baptist Church in Lake Zurich, Illinois. Wonderful school that I have loved for many years. Sent students to before I was on the staff of, and rejoiced in. And I have a title of vice president there. What I do there is actually what would be referred to as academic dean, be the title more often. And they just gave me the title vice president because I used to be a college president, and it sounded right. But and because of that, the kind of work I do, I can do most of it on the road. I can do most of it and communicate back and so forth. But the Lord has just blessed us with some things. We just started a Bible college in the Philippines. Now, I've been going and teaching at colleges in the Philippines for 29 years and still teach at other colleges, but we just started one there. Property, campus, staff, and so I function as the academic dean for that as well. And that's just a very exciting opportunity. And then right now, we are in the process of looking at moving our college campus. We have an interesting setting. We've been in a beautiful spot, 13 buildings, 4 houses. Cindy and I live in one of the houses. But in the state forest, literally, is an easement through the state forest. You get to it, beautiful location and all that's with it. But we're looking at moving from there into a one-building campus that has twice the floor space of the 13 buildings we have now. I mean, it's huge. And it was the headquarters for a Fortune 500 company, 2 stories, attached parking garage. It's also out in forestry type area, but not technically in the forest. It's only about 5 minutes from our church. It is just an amazing facility, and what God has done opening up the thought processes on that. We're at the point where we're at now where we have our girls' dorm is 100% full. Our guys' dorm, we added on to it as much as we could, and it's got a couple spots left in it. And we felt like we need to do something more. We have 141 students in what's probably a 150-student campus. And so we're looking at this, and a lot of parts to this story to get up to where I'm telling you, but we got involved with this and looked at it, and we're asking $3 million for the property. And our folks estimated it'd take $3 million to remodel it into what we needed it to be. And by the grace of God, somebody put us in touch with the Hobby Lobby folks. They have a program whereby they buy buildings, keep them for a year, and then donate them to not-for-profit organizations. So Hobby Lobby's already negotiated with the owner of this building and reached an agreement. There's just one thing waiting, and if that would happen, then Hobby Lobby would buy that building this month and donate it to us a year from now. They have to own it for a year to get all the tax right away. But they would let us spend that whole year prepping the remodeling. But here's the only thing. The area that this building is in is a township that does not allow any multifamily dwellings. No apartment buildings, no anything. So dormitories, and we'd like to have this huge building with a boys' dorm at one end and a girls' dorm at the other end, requires a change in zoning and zoning regulations. And the way it's set up, you have to have 2 hearings before you can make a change, and the hearings have to be 6 months apart. I had a hearing 6 months ago, I think it's Friday, we have the next hearing. And if that would go and we get the variance we want, then Hobby Lobby purchases this building and donates it to us. And then we still have the challenge of the remodeling, but we were talking about a $6 million challenge. Now we're talking about a $3 million challenge. That comes a long way in one swoop. And when this first came up, it's on a lake. It's on a beautiful lake. Long, just building goes on and on and on forever, all lakeside. And across the lake, there's several $1 million homes. And when they first heard about the idea of a college coming in across the lake, that created some questions for them. I understand that completely. You know what you normally think of with a college. But when we had the first hearing, the Lake County Police came out and said that in the 35-year history of Dayspring Bible College, they've never had one incident that involved a Dayspring student on or off campus, ever. And that helped a whole lot with folks. So I'd appreciate your prayers. This could be finalized before this week is over. There's also a chance it can be thrown back to another hearing later, or it could be turned down, but we really believe the way things are looking that it probably will be finalized. But I'd sure be grateful for your prayers about that. It's just a huge facility. They'll build dorms at either end. There'll be a section that is staff apartments, which is where Cindy and I would live, and I would have an office there, and we'd have a chapel and just a number of things. It'd just be an incredible opportunity. At the same time, we're building a campus in the Philippines, and that's going on right now. I just got to be there for the first time in January, and we're already making some great plans for what we want to do when I go back in August. And when I go back, my every year January trip is going to be moved to February, starting this next year. But we're spent a lot of time today making plans and sorting things out for all that. I'd be grateful for your prayers. James chapter 3. Church's biggest problem. I mean, talk about churches and problems, there are things that come to mind. A lot of times churches have real economic problems, financial problems. Sometimes they bring those problems on themselves by doing foolish things, but things happen that churches have no control over. Had a friend, built a great church out in a steel town in Pennsylvania, and big steel factory, and that was the center of town, and they built a strong church, and running about 1,200 a Sunday. And the steel factory moved out of the country. It collapsed the economy in that town. And man, it quickly changed circumstances for that church. Second church, I've pastored 3 churches. Second church I pastored was in an automotive town in Indiana. And it had been a strong church, around about 400, and had a great pastor, and he'd been there for many years and done some tremendous things, and God had honored and used it. And all the automotive factories closed down. And it collapsed the town. And by the time I went there to pastor, and with those folks, and some of the most wonderful people you would ever have found in your life, but they were all senior citizens, because the whole younger generation had moved out of that town. So basically what you had were retired people. And they were great people and wonderful people to pastor, and there are many wonderful things about being there, but one year that I was there, we had 50 funerals. Man, it's hard to get the church excited when every week when you're up in the announcements, you're talking about the funeral of the week. And that was a challenge. And that meant that church had to rethink everything financially through no fault of their own. They're not the ones that moved the automobile factories. And that wasn't their fault. Sometimes churches have terrible financial problems that is their fault because of foolishness. But sometimes they have big financial problems that's not their fault at all. But that's not the biggest problem plaguing churches. Some folks could say doctrine, because we sure have seen an awful lot of churches compromised doctrinally. When I first went to Chicago, and Chicago has a reputation of being one of the most wicked cities in the country, and a reputation it deserves, and I thought there must not be many churches there. Man, was I wrong. There's churches everywhere in Chicago. It's the most church place I'd ever seen. You had a hard going through a block without finding a church on that block. And many of them, once upon a time, were real Bible-believing, gospel-preaching churches. It's amazing. And I got to studying back in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. If you wanted to have a big meeting for preachers, you went to Chicago because there were so many preachers there. Not now. North side of Chicago, 2 million people. 2 independent Baptist churches. There's supposed to have been some more on the south side. I had trouble finding any of them. And it was an amazing thing. And I remember we did a massive scripture portion distribution. We got to 1 million homes in Chicago. We wanted to get to more than that, but we got to 1 million in a year. Scripture portions. And of course that met a lot of interesting people. And we were going by door to door, and there was a church on that street. And the name of the church was the Missionary Stranger Baptist Church. I just saw that sign, said, that's an unusual name. And the man came walking out of the building, asked us what we were doing. We told him. Turned out he was the pastor. He was very gracious. And he said, I got a preacher's meeting at this church Saturday. Would you come preach at my preacher's meeting? I said, well, I'd be honored to. But could I ask you a question? Where did your church name come from? He said, I've never seen that. Missionary Stranger Baptist Church. Could you tell me where the name came from? He said, no, I can't. He said, nobody knows. He said, the church is over 100 years old. None of us here go back far enough to know why it has that name. And he said, we all wonder why it has that name. Of course, I changed the name, but I didn't bother to tell him. Tell other folks how to run their business. But there it was, and it at one time had been a thriving church. But all over Chicago, churches that have been corrupted doctrinally and are no longer strong, thriving churches. Some could say morals, and that certainly can be an issue. There's a church that was down the road from where, a couple miles, but on the same road where the church I pastored was. And we had a family that lived right across the street from that church. This church had been famous in years past in Chicago. Sword of the Lord conferences had been held there. Pastor would know what that means. And it was a big-time church. And one Sunday night, it was very cold, below zero. And the family that lived across the street from that church, when they came out after the Sunday night church service, car wouldn't start. That happens in the deep cold sometimes. And I told them, look, don't worry about this. We'll get the men on it in the morning when it's light and it'll be easier. Just let me take you home tonight and we'll get your car going in the morning and bring it out to you. So we went out. I'd heard about the church across the street, but I managed to get there about the time it was the Sunday evening service was letting out. It had become a homosexual church. And nobody had said that on the sign, similar to that information on that, but nobody had to tell you on the sign when you saw the folks coming out. You knew. All those things are issues. But none of those have destroyed as many churches, at least in terms of what I've seen, as what we're going to look at tonight. Biggest challenge to the church is people's tongues. And our biggest challenge is the tongue. See, it never goes away. I never had to drink alcohol in my life. I'm glad for that. I was tempted a couple times when I was a teenager, but I never drank. But to be real honest with you, having gone 71 years without drinking, I'm really not wrestling with much temptation over that now. I got a suspicion I get the rest of the way without any trouble with that. I've never been tempted to embezzle millions of dollars. I'd like to believe I'd be strong and faithful if I was around millions of dollars, but I've never been tempted to embezzle millions of dollars because I was never around millions of dollars. It never came up. But everybody has a problem with the tongue. Look with me if you would. James chapter 3, verse 1. My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For many things we offend all. Y'all know that. You're around somebody long enough, they will say something that offends you. I mean, we get married, glassy-eyed, excited, with the belief we found the perfect person. I mean, nothing could be like that. We just found the perfect person, and it's all wonderful, it's all great. I remember the week before Cindy and I got married, we went to a marriage seminar. We thought that'd be good timing, and we went, and they had this exercise, and they passed out pencils and paper, and they asked you to put down your partner's 3 biggest faults. And we were a week from getting married. She couldn't think of anything. Not a thing. I don't take her to programs like that now. Number 1, I don't have that much paper. And number 2, I don't think my ego could take it. And I'm not sure 1 pencil would do. We get married and remain deeply in love, but we can all think of moments we sure do wish the one we loved hadn't said that. Y'all got it. You know what I'm saying? Many things we offend all. You find the most wonderful, perfect pastor in the world. And thank God you folks have a marvelous pastor. I know hundreds of preachers. I don't say that accidentally. You folks have a wonderful pastor. But if you stay with a pastor long enough, you're inevitably going to say, why did he say that? And if you think that's tough, you should try pastoring 100 people or so. Because sooner or later, every one of you will say something, I just can't believe they said that. Many things we offend all. If a man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Man, if you found somebody that never misuses the tongue, you would have found a perfect person. And that's not any of us. And the Bible is going to illustrate for us in the next several verses how serious this is. See if these don't sound like serious things. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Compares our tongue to the bit in the horse's mouth. Here's that. The things we say get us in so much trouble. We have to live up to, deal with, get out of, whatever. The things we say exercise such influence over our life. I grew up working at a Christian camp every summer. Camp had horses. The week before camp started, they invited any of the male staff that wanted to come down a week early to ride the horses all week. Horses hadn't been ridden all year. They get pretty rough, and we got to get them gentled down for the kids to be there. So that's all you had to do. Ride horses all day. And I was used to riding horses at camp. I thought, man, that's a week. I didn't know much what horses were like that weren't used to being ridden. And they weren't ready to be ridden. And they didn't want you to bother them. And that first day, you're putting a saddle on that thing, and you're putting the bridle in that horse's mouth, and you decided you're going to take that horse that way, and that horse will go any direction except the one you pointed it in. And they have all kinds of tricks. They like to rub up next to a tree, rub your leg up next to the tree. But boy, my legs were black and blue after that week from horses trying to pull that trick. And this is one of the things you had to learn. You've got to get a hold on that bridle and keep 100% control of it all the time, or you're in trouble. Did you understand that? You understand the tongue. How about this, verse 4? Behold also the ships, which though they be so great and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth. And you get out in a ship, and it's got a rudder of any kind. That rudder controls what direction is going, even though it's not a very big part of the ship. Your tongue will control the direction your life goes. You'll say things, you say, I can't believe I said that, but now you're stuck with it. You'll say things and get people to trust you. You'll say things and get people to be angry with you. You'll make commitments and wonder, how in the world did I make that commitment? I mean, it's a serious business. Let's see another comparison. Horses' bits, helms. Verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. Just got to start a little fire. And you end up with something like they have out in Los Angeles. The Bible compares our tongue to that little fire. Well, I've seen that so many times over the years. I have the great privilege of being in 60 to 80 churches a year. I think it was 82 last year. And I know lots of preachers, and I hear the blessings of God on them. But I also know the heartaches they have to deal with. And it's incredible how much heartache is caused by people using the tongue carelessly. I was in a preacher's meeting over near Youngstown, Ohio, years ago. And there was a fellow on his way driving to the meeting, and his car broke down. And he thought it was something he could fix. And he got out on the side of the road working on that car and kind of put it back together and what he had to do. But, I mean, he just looked terrible. He had grease on his clothes, and he just looked frustrated. He'd been sweating in the sun, and he just looked terrible when he drove in to the camp meeting. And everybody was kidding him. So, man, you look terrible. Look like you've been out in a drunk or something. Joking. Before he got home, I don't know if he ever found out. Before he got home, somebody got a hold of the idea that he'd been caught out on a drunk. And they were calling everybody in the church to tell him. And they said, and I'd preached in that church a lot, and the people knew me. And they were telling him, said, Brother Stringer was one of the ones that caught him. And after it had gone around the whole church, somebody thought to call Brother Stringer. You're crazy. You know how much damage had been done by then? What a fire had been spread. One little tongue. It's incredible how much damage one little tongue can do. The tongue is a fire. Didn't the Lord just say that? He's repeating it now. You don't suppose we should learn something from that? Did your mom ever do that with you? Tell you something and in the next sentence say it again? I don't know about you. I heard that a lot. My mom repeated things 3 times a lot. I assumed because she thought I was so hard-headed, it would take that many times to get through to me. But whatever the reason was, I would hear things a lot. And I remember thinking, I heard that already. But God does that here. It's a fire. Look again, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire of hell. Wow. Sometimes that fire that comes from the tongue would make you think that fire had been started by hell itself. I've seen it in people's lives. What I said tonight, the theme was, the greatest challenge of the local church. It can take one person misusing the tongue in a local church to do endless amounts of damage. That's not our problem. I hate to break this to you. That is all of our problem. Look at verse 7. For every kind of beasts and of birds and of serpents and things in the sea is tamed and hath been tamed of mankind, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil. You want another comparison? Full of deadly poison. Yeah. Get a snake with poison in it, and you get that poison, it don't have to be very much poison. You get a poison from that snake put in a human being. I was preaching at a camp in northern Michigan, and one of the young ladies was off in an area she wasn't supposed to be, but she ended up getting bitten by a poisonous snake. And you get bitten by a poisonous snake, you really have about 2 hours. The kind of snakes we have in the United States, you have about 2 hours to deal with the poison. And so they were about half hour from a hospital. They had a snake bite kit, but nobody there really knew how to use it. They asked if anybody had training, snake bite kit training. And I reluctantly raised my hand. I don't know if you know much about a snake bite kit. They're very simple things. They have razor blade. And you cut 3 slices into the bite and suck out the poison. To be real honest with you, I didn't want to suck out any snake poison. They said, we got 30 minutes. And so they'd try to get her to the hospital emergency room, but they wanted me to ride with them just in case something happened and they couldn't get there in time, that the one guy who's had training, would be with them. So I'm sitting in the back seat with her, and you put ice on it, and that ice will slow down the spread and give you a little bit longer. So I'm sitting there holding ice on her arm and watching and praying that the car didn't break down or anything. And the poison, you can see it moving up. And I'd adjust the ice, to try and slow it down. I'm just watching it. It wasn't a lot of poison, but it could destroy a whole human body. And the tongue can be like that poison. Therefore, bless we God, even the Father, and therefore curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. We ought to be real careful what we have to say, how we say it, who we say it to. If the fountain sent forth at the same place sweet water and bitter, the idea is if people hear you say mean and poisonous things about people, do you think they look at you and say, I bet that's a real Christian? The truth is, every Christian has this weakness. Some have it more than others. Some of them, it's a besetting sin that controls them. I've known folks over the years who moved from one church to another church to another church, because every church they went to, they had a sour spirit, and their gossip would cause trouble, and they eventually create a stir, and they'd just go from one thing to another. I was pastoring up in Chicago. There was a group of people. There was related. There was about 20 or so of them. Had some musical ability in the group and some money in the group. And they'd go to a church, and they just thought the pastor was the most wonderful thing in the world. And they'd talk about how great he was until they got upset. And then they'd start gossiping and assuming and spreading rumors. And they had just caused trouble, a lot of trouble, in 3 churches in a row. And they came to the church I pastored one Sunday morning. The group of them. I had just heard about the last trouble they were in. And they came forward on the invitation said, Pastor Stringer, this was the greatest sermon we ever heard. We just know this is the place where we belong. We like to come for membership. And that particular church had in the church constitution, you had to meet with the pastor first, and the pastor had to recommend you. And they hadn't met with me. And so they're in front of everybody. And I just said, let me make this perfectly clear. The pastor does not recommend these folks. I said, you're not going to do here what you did in the last 3 churches. So you're going to tear this church up, it's not going to be this one. They were a little offended at that. And you might find that hard to believe. They never came to hear me preach again, ever. I don't think I've ever seen one of them since that day. Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either a vine figs, so can no fountain yield forth salt water and fresh? Who's a wise man and dealed with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. You want to have a good testimony? You have it with the things you say. I've seen Christians who I think want to be soul winners say miserable, hard, mean things to lost people, thinking they could get their attention for the gospel, and it doesn't work, and it makes it harder for anybody else to win them. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. Philippians chapter 1, Paul tells a story. He's in prison, but there are folks out preaching the gospel, and some of them are preaching the gospel out of a good spirit, but he says some of them are preaching out of contention, hoping to add to his bondage. They are jealous of Paul. Why would God use Paul like he did? Paul wrote 13, I think 14 books of scripture. That must have been something. And said, well, God should have inspired a book for me through me. I'd have been a better one for him to use than him. Some of them had, even though they were preaching the truth about the gospel, were preaching it with a bad spirit. I don't know about you, but I met some preachers like that. Fit that category pretty good. And the Bible says that because there was envy in their hearts, they caused strife. Whenever envy is the motive, strife will be the method. You can count on it. This wisdom descendeth not from above. Well, let's see how the Lord's going to describe that way of doing things. Calls it earthly. Now, the person who feels the need to gossip, give their opinion, imagine what other folks were thinking, he called that earthly. But he didn't just call it earthly. He called it sensual. Not spiritual, it's sensual. But he didn't just call it sensual. He called it devilish. The devil gets into churches using people's tongues, generates problems that can destroy ministries. In my 52 years of preaching, started preaching when I was 3. Anyway, my 52 years of preaching, I've seen more churches destroyed by somebody's tongue over unimportant things, even if they were true, over minor things. I've seen them do damage to unsaved people so that they couldn't be reached for Christ. I've seen them do damage to new Christians who didn't think Christians would act like that. I've seen them destroy whole churches to zap the strength out of churches. First church I pastored had 7 preachers in 23 years. It had a reputation as a preacher killer church. What I mean by that, 6 of the 7 pastors left the ministry when they left the church. And you'd think a smart man would not be the next pastor in that church. And a smart man wasn't, but I was. In the situation before me, this is in a small town, 200 houses in town. Small town. They'd had a business meeting, and they'd been having an argument, some of the folks with the pastor. And the pastor fell down on the platform with a heart attack. And they decided he was faking, and so they were all up yelling at him, telling him to get up and quit faking, while somebody called 911. And EMTs came out, and they came up and they listened to all these people yelling at the patient they were trying to work on. They had to push him aside to get him, put him on a stretcher, take him to the hospital. Months later, before they called the pastor, they called me. And I got there. I thought, well, this is going to be my first goal. There's 200 houses in town. I'm going to every house. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to invite them to church and witness to them and whatever it is I can do on the situation. And I got 200 cards, and one put the address of every house on, so I'll just keep a record. If there was nobody home, I'll make a note of that, and I'll go back later. And so I had a card for every home in town. So first house I got in, folks were very nice. They proceeded to tell me the story about that business meeting because they'd heard about it, and it shocked them so much. Second house I got into, they told me the story about that business meeting. Third house I got into told me about that business meeting. Okay? Every single home in that town knew that story and were repulsed by it. There was not an exception. I got along great with those people. Later on, the city of Indianapolis incorporated that town into the city, and they asked me to be their representative to the city of Indianapolis. As all those things were worked out, I got along great with them. But none of them were coming to that church. I led several of them to Christ in my office or in their home. But none of them were coming to that church. And when, after 4 years, they treated me as badly as they treated the previous pastor, folks in town were saying, we knew this was going to happen, and that's why we didn't come. Devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good works, without partiality, without hypocrisy. You got somebody talking to you, and you want to know whether their speech is wise. Is it pure? Is it peaceable? If they see a problem, do they want to solve the problem or exploit it? Are they gentle? Are they easy to be entreated? Are they full of mercy? Or do they want to pounce on somebody when they find their first weakness? Without partiality, without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in the peace of them that make peace. Glory to God. The time to come to grips with all this is exactly the moment when a church is not having a problem with it. When you're having a problem with it, everybody's all started up, and it's hard for them to think this through. God gave us an entire chapter in the Bible and references many, many other places to the proper use of the tongue for a reason. But every Christian ought to make some decisions about the tongues. Number one, I'm not going to be the person that God uses to hurt, or that the devil uses to hurt a church. I will not be. No matter what, that won't be me. And secondly, I won't be the one that listens to somebody that's trying to hurt a church. Church I was a member of asked me to be a deacon, and then the chairman of the deacons, and I was in that position, and a man in the church got a hold of me. He says, I need to come talk to you about some things. And he came to see me, and he was listening to me, his complaints about the pastor. And I said, well, you've been to the pastor with those things? He said, oh, no. I can't talk to him about those things. I said, why are you talking to me? He said, well, something needs to be done about those things. I said, well, why aren't you talking to him? I wrote them all down, everything he said. As soon as he left, I called the pastor, said, could I come by for a minute? I went to see him, sat down in his living room, said, Mr. So-and-so was just at my house, and these are the 7 things he said, and I told him he needs to bring them to you. And I want you to know about the conversation, and I'm not in sympathy with his way of doing things at all, but just so you know, these are the 7 things he said. You might guess the pastor had a visit with him shortly. The guy said, "You betrayed me by telling the pastor what I said about him." I said, "Well, is betray you or betray the Lord, one or the other?" And if you have a problem, you take it to the person that can solve it and deal with it in the right way, and you don't bring it to me because I'm not going to be the person that listens to it. That spirit would save a lot of churches. That spirit, before it was needed, would save a lot of churches. Yeah. Let me take you one place real quick. 1 John chapter 3. John talks about 3 different people in the church. Verse 9, I wrote into the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. For if I come, I'll remember his deeds, which he doth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Diotrephes, he wanted everybody's attention. He wanted everybody to look at him. He wanted to be the big shot. I'm going to tell you what, Diotrephes lived to be an old man. I know because I pastored him in 3 different churches. I got up one time, preached a message on Diotrephes. The only illustrations I used were from a previous pastorate. One man in the church was so angry after that sermon that he's calling folks on the phone and say, he was preaching about me. And some of them were wise enough to say, what made you think that? You understand? It's the biggest problem churches have. It's the one that kills the most churches. It's the one that's the most devastating. It's the one that drives off the most new converts. It is the one that keeps the most lost people from getting saved. It's the one that breaks the heart of the most preachers and deacons and spiritual leaders in the church. There are decisions people need to make because of something that already exists in their life, but I'm also big on preaching on what I call preventative decisions. Folks saying, Lord, don't ever, and I don't mean publicly, but people saying, Lord, don't ever let this happen to me. Don't ever let me be the one that makes this mistake. God gave us a whole chapter and dozens of other references to warn us all. Because here's the thing. Some of you, I'm just sure, aren't going to go out and get drunk next week. Just not going to happen. No temptation to you. I imagine most of you here aren't going to go into heresy next week. It's just not going to happen. Many of you have been around the truth for a long time, and that's why you're here. But any one of us could fall into this sin next week. It'd be a heartache to the work of God. Some sins belong primarily to the young. Some sins are primarily learned when you're young. Some sins primarily come from the culture that you grew up in. But the tongue, every one of us was born with and is carried with us every day of our life. And it'll carry with us every day till we're done. May God help us. May God help me that it not be me. May God help all of us that it not be us. I have a little type of challenge. When I'm a member of a church, I'm a preacher that a lot of our folks know, who've heard me preach They've read books I wrote. And it's only natural at times they'd want to ask me questions. Man, I have a policy. You cannot bring a complaint or a difference of opinion. We have a large church and a lot of staff. You cannot bring a complaint or a difference of opinion with anybody on our church staff to me, ever. Not because they think they're all perfect. I've been preaching 52 years. I have a position on everything, absolutely everything. Nobody in the world could match all of my positions. But I don't ever want to be the person that James 3 was written about, the fire, the poison. Y'all got the point? This message was not preached for a public invitation. This message was preached that we might have this preventive attitude that we would never let ourselves be the person that this warning is about. God bless you all, dear folks.